Lecture is on progressivism, kind of the second half or second part of progressivism. I want to talk about things that are kind of going on in society during this time that kind of feed into progressivism, and then we'll kind of move into other kind of issues of progressivism. So what I want to start off with is basically talking about what's going on in society at this point in time. When you talk about women, I had talked about in the last lecture, is that women are really challenged, they're really supported, women are going to do a lot with the progressive movement. And so you kind of see this new woman kind of emerging, and it's also an ideology of maybe of what women can be, and you see women definitely pushing the boundaries. So in this time period you have what's referred to as the new woman, and it's women basically challenging society, pushing the envelope, if you will, and doing more, really kind of doing things that they hadn't done before because in a sense society wouldn't let them. So examples of kind of women pushing the boundaries of society. You have this woman by the name of Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley was an entertainer. She was a performer and entertainer. And she is going to be a part of the Wild West shows. Wild West shows in this time period were really big. They were a really popular form of entertainment. And it was basically about riding horses in different positions and lassoing cattle and sharpshooting and doing all of that on a horse. And it just showed their skills and their marksmanship. And so you had what was known as Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show. And Buffalo Bill was, in a sense, kind of like that superstar of the day. He was that performer. And you're going to have him bring in, and the woman who gets to be a part of his show is known as Oakley Annie. I'm sorry, Annie Oakley. And Annie Oakley basically was performing with Wild Bill, and she basically could do anything a man could do. She could ride a horse in different positions on the saddle, and she was a sharpshooter, and she could lasso cattle, and do sharpshooting while on a horse. And she became a star. She became wealthy, and she's definitely doing so by doing things that women aren't necessarily expected to do. And so she was showing women that you can do things, you can push the boundaries, you can push the envelope, and you can do the things that you want to do, definitely not in your comfort zone. So you have that, okay? And then you have, once again, this kind of women who broke the norm, this new woman. Now, there's also going to be what's known as the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl is like late 1890s, and the Gibson Girl, in a sense, was actually created by a man. You have a man by the name of Charles Dana Gibson, and he'll do these drawings of what he said was a modern woman. And these drawings really depicted women looking differently. Okay, and his drawings are going to be in like Life magazine, and then it's going to take off. Women wanted to look like that, and so then he basically, all the Gibson Girl drawings of Gibson then were all over it. That was basically the pictures you saw in advertising, and it was drawings and all over society, and women definitely emulated that. It was definitely a certain look. On your PowerPoint, there's a slide of the Gibson Girl. So what is the Gibson Girl, or the look of the Gibson Girl? The Gibson Girl had long hair, and she had it in a bun, but it was, I would call it a looser bun. Her hair was looser, it wasn't pulled back as tight. Her clothing was a little bit more revealing. It was a little bit kind of dropping down on the neck, if you will, or kind of chest area, if you will. Some of it even might be, well, you had all over. You could have it like right on the kind of edge of your shoulder, but you also had Gibson Girls that had a neckline, and you didn't really necessarily kind of see the chest, so that was kind of all over the place. But the blouse wasn't as, the blouse or your dresses were not as tight. They were definitely more loose fitting, and then you usually went into a kind of a tight waist or a kind of a, in a sense, a thin waist, if you will. And then it went out into a skirt or a dress. And it's not that it's the fact that a woman's like, you know, showing off so much skin. It was just looser. It was more feminine. It was softer looking. And also the hair definitely was different. The hair, the loose kind of bun. And so you have this type of look. Okay, and then you have what goes along with it. You have a Gibson girl that was healthy. She looked very healthy, kind of sensual, kind of softer, if you will. And there was also kind of a little bit of a rebellious spirit in these young women. And you have women who, people who emulated being a Gibson girl, or the idea of a Gibson girl was basically like, basically a young woman, white, college educated, or some type of college educated, sexy, self-supporting, could definitely be self-supporting, and they push the boundaries by wanting to play sports and playing sports. And when I say playing sports, I mean like golf or tennis. That was very popular at that point in time. Some even smoked in public. And if you're a proper lady at this time, you don't smoke or drink in public. And the Gibson girls kind of pushed that. They kind of smoked in public. That was definitely a choice. But you have this woman who is confident, in herself, can support herself, and she is kind of softer, if you will. Her hair is looser, the clothes are looser and not as form-fitting. And it's just like a softer look for women. I guess that's the best way to put it. But it's challenging the boundaries of society. Okay. Now, also, just overall in general, other things that women are doing. Women are really kind of finding us an independence, if you will. In this time period, you're actually going to see, and this is, I would say, more of like 1900s, you would see women starting to get their pilot license, because there's no law on being a pilot. All you had to do was take the test and do the training, basically, and pass for you to become a pilot. So that was something that women could do, and you're starting to see women become pilots. Another one is some women would go out in the town without an escort. At this point in time, if you were a lady, you always went out in public with an escort. It could be a boyfriend, a father, a brother, a cousin, some male person, basically, who was your escort in town. And so in this time period, women are kind of pushing it, and that's their kind of independence, that they didn't always need an escort. Okay, now moving away from that, I want to talk about employed women in all of this. Employed women obviously facing a huge amount of challenges of working and trying to maintain a home. If they worked and sometimes women actually worked at home, they would do piecework, they would do like some sewing, or sometimes making like cigarettes and cigars was something that you could do at home. Also piecework, you might be doing a little bit of sewing, and you could definitely do that at home. Very, very low pay. Okay, and definitely puts them into poverty. If they were working in a factory, as we talked about, very long wages, or very long hours, very low wages, and very poor conditions. When you talk about 1900, more women are working for a wage than before. It is estimated 1 out of 5 women worked for a wage, and many of those obviously are going to be in factories. But women, as we know, worked in other places. Women working in department stores, which is a little bit easier. Maybe a little bit better paying, better conditions. Also telephone operators, telegraphs operators. So there definitely were other options for women, as we had talked about before. If you talk about shop girls, okay, and shop girls are the girls working in the department stores. 1899, shop girls received $2 to $3 a week, or that basically works out to 6 to 10 cents per hour. By 1910, women worked as stenographers and typists, and they will basically do 80% of the work. So stenographers and typists are also now becoming basically women's work. Now, this also is not going to make them wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, and probably it's not even, they might be on the edge of middle class working with their husbands if their husbands are working. So you're definitely getting paid more than if you worked in a factory, but it's definitely not good pay, and you're going to be doing that for the rest of your life. Okay, now protests, okay, protests. And this is kind of a part of progressivism, that you have some reform-minded people, and they basically want to make life better or try to call attention to the problems of society. And a lot of progressivism definitely was a part of journalism, and I believe I had mentioned it before, but you have this group of people within journalism known as muckrakers, and muckrakers are going to talk about the problems of society, and they're trying to bring attention to the problems of society. And they write about a lot of conditions. They can write about anti-monopoly or monopolies, however you want to see that. They'll write about the poor working conditions. They'll write about the poverty, living in poverty, what poverty does to children. They'll talk about education, children not getting into education, but you also have a good amount of journalists that are going to write about factory conditions, and they're trying to bring attention to the problems of society and of the problems within the factories, the long working hours. They talk about child labor, and some of these writers are going to be women. So, and some women are going to have a view, I would say, a little bit left, meaning a little more radical, but it doesn't mean that every muckraker is a radical. I don't want you to think that, but you have some women going in that direction. And so those are some of the women I'm going to talk about. You have Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She's going to write what becomes a book. It's called Women in Economics. Charlotte Gilman was definitely radical, and she was definitely very radical at the time. She believed that a woman's economic dependence of men destroyed the female personality. So Gilman, in her book, Women and Economics, she believed that women's economic dependence of men destroyed the female personality. She argued that independent women made happier and more effective wives, mothers, and individuals. So she's really promoting women to be economically economically independent. Now, 1909 to 1916, Charlotte Gilman is going to create a journal. It's called The Forerunner, and it's a journal. It's basically for women, about women, and it's really about economic reform and suffrage movement. If you looked at the dates of her magazine, it was 1909 to 1916, and it kind of starts to die off in 16. And the reason being, you have World War I going on, so people aren't really paying attention to what's going, the kind of domestic issues going on what's in the country. But another thing is, some people found her too radical. Even like working people and working women who kind of might have gotten into it a little bit, for some of them, it was a little too radical. Some women at this point in time were like, I don't have a problem being married. I just want to have more money. I don't necessarily have to be economically independent. I just want more money in life. And so she tended to be a little more radical for some. And like her magazine is definitely going to die off because of it. Okay, now you have what's known as the social women's movement. Okay, 1870 to 1914. 1870 to 1914, the time period that we're talking about, kind of this progressive time period. Once again, you're going to have women who are writing, and they're writing about working conditions and just the issues of labor. Okay, you have a woman by the name of Lucy Parsons. Lucy Parsons. Lucy Parsons is going to write for journals, or the journals The Socialist and The Labor Defender. They're two journals, and Lucy Parsons is going to write for them. And once again, I would say she's a little bit more on the radical side. She will blame the capitalistic system for the exploitation of women. She'll say that our capitalistic society basically exploits women because, you know, many of the people in the factory are women and they're working hard hours and they're going to live in poverty. Another one, this is also coming from Lucy Parsons. A woman's economic dependence on a man made her a slave. Another woman, Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman is going to be, she's going to do a lot within the labor movement. She's going to write and she's going to lecture. Some people will basically refer to her as an anarchist. An anarchist is a person who does not believe in a formal government. So Emma Goldman is also going to be kind of on that radical side. She was the editor for the Mother Earth, and the Mother Earth was a journal. Okay, she advocated couples living together without marriage. She advocated birth control, and these two issues are very touchy subjects. These are subjects that you don't talk about, and these are subjects that you, in a sense, don't do if you talk about mainstream society. Mainstream society is you get married, and then you go in the direction of having kids. And you shouldn't be talking about birth control. You shouldn't be practicing it. So she also is definitely on, she's a little more radical. I'm going to call her a little more radical, not just because of the living together without marriage and birth control, because a lot of women would kind of want those things. But she definitely spoke out against labor, and that it basically, it hurt women because of their dependency on working on in the factory for low wages. Okay, another woman, Kate O'Hare, O-H-A-R-E, Kate O'Hare, definitely a feminist and a socialist. She talked about the suffrage movement. She also she advocated for maternity benefits for women, and she unsuccessfully ran for Congress. I know the things that I talk about are not, I mean, they sound pretty good. Maternity benefits for women, those are, and in our day and age, that's pretty basic. Women's suffrage, but at the time, it was definitely radical. Okay, so we're still talking about labor. I want to talk about labor reform and still talking about those issues. You're going to have millions of immigrants, as I mentioned before. Millions of immigrants are going to come into the United States. Many of those do not speak English and they have to learn English. But the fact is that these women are going to come and they're going to work in the factories. They're going to be put into poverty. And they also need a huge amount of assistance. Because they're in poverty, because they need to learn English. They need to learn basically kind of how to live in America. 1910 to 1915, okay, 1910 to 1915, about 500,000 immigrant women are going to come into the United States, and they are either under 30 or just around the age of 30. And as I said, definitely need a lot of assistance to learn English, to learn how to be American, if you will, and definitely going into the factories. They work for very low wages, working in factories, low wages, long hours, poor conditions. But you will also see them once they get settled and once they kind of figure out kind of like how to live in the States, you'll see them creating organizations such as the Immigrant Protective League in Chicago. I'm just giving you that as an example, but there will be immigrant protection leagues in other major cities like New York City. You'll see that. You'll also have the National Women's Trade Union League. The National Women's Trade Union League. This is definitely going to be highly populated by immigrant women. And this is also a place where they could bring their problems. If they had problems, this is where they could go talk about them and try to see how to deal with the problems. They could also get a little bit of access to healthcare and basic assistance through these organizations. As they get assimilated, you find more clubs, more organizations, not always having to do with labor. Some examples would be like the Polish Women's Alliance, the Finnish Women's Cooperative Home, and these were more organizations, I would call them social, but also it's basically how to kind of get through it together, and they could rely on women that kind of were from their own culture, and it was like, we'll try and figure it out together. But it was also a social kind of a network, if you will, kind of like a social, kind of as a safety network, right? You can kind of get through and learn from other women, like little bits and pieces on how to kind of get through and live in the United States. Okay, now, moving on, still talking about labor, strikes and violence. In this time period, when you talk about union labors, you're going to see a huge amount of violence. You're going to see a huge amount of strikes, and strikes usually turn into violence some way, shape, or form. I had mentioned it before in the previous lecture that women are definitely going to be a part of unions, and so women are definitely going to be strong members of unions. And so when there are strikes, you will see women go out on strike, and so you will see women sometimes get caught up in the violence or perhaps be a part of it themselves. Kind of depends on the woman. Okay, 1909, you have the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Okay, 1909, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This is actually a very large union because you have a huge amount of women in the garment district. Okay, 1909, it was previously ran by a man, because all unions at this point in time are basically run by men. But they're going to bring in their first female organizer who will basically be the one to organize strikes. So women aren't getting into positions of actual power of like running the union, but they will definitely be brought into like decision-making positions. So having said that, you're going to have 1909, you're going to have the shirtwaist workers strike in New York and Philadelphia. This is going to be the largest women's strike in American history, and women are going to be picketing, they're going to be speaking, they're going to be writing, and they're definitely going to be kind of the major strikers for the 1909 shirtwaist workers strike in New York and Philadelphia. And the number I have is about 20,000 women went on strike for this strike. Okay, now moving on to 1911, but we are in New York City. There's going to be a fire, and it's going to be at what's called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Okay, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And real quick before I move on, the term shirtwaist. A shirtwaist is an old-fashioned name for a blouse. Okay, so a shirtwaist is just a blouse. Okay, so 1911, New York City, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And there's going to be a fire that breaks out. It is on the 8th floor, and it's going to go from the 8th floor into the 10th floor. And what happens is they do actually have a no smoking rule, but it's not necessarily enforced. And so somebody's smoking, the ashes fall down on the ground. You've got all the pieces of material that are on the floor, and basically it catches fire. And so the buildings weren't really built for fires in mind at all. And so if a fire breaks out in one room, okay, it's just going to spread. And when it goes up into the ceiling, and the ceiling is connected to a floor. There's no gap or anything. And so fire spreads very easily in these older buildings, or in the buildings at that point in time. And so you're going to have a fire that's spreading very quickly. There's no like fire exits or anything like that, okay? They actually do have some fire ladders outside the building, but they're not the greatest fire ladders. So there's going to be major problems with this fire. You have fire that's going to consume floors and then go up floors, spread up floors. And people don't know how to get out because the rooms are filled with smoke. They have only one door that they can get through. People will literally die because they're basically smushed as the rest of the people. They're basically trampled on if you fall. People will trample on you to get out the door, which is extremely sad. But then you also have smoke inhalation. You have people who don't know how to get out and they get lost and then they get just consumed by the smoke. Some people that actually do get out will try and get out windows. Now that's kind of hit and miss because some windows are locked. Some people can get out windows and they get to the fire ladders, the fire escape ladders, and they get on the fire escape ladders. The fire escape ladders, at that point in time, they will find out, really are only going to hold about 2 people. So when you have like 3 or 4 people on a ladder, the ladder can't hold the weight, and the ladder itself will break away from the wall, and the people on the ladder will fall. And so you have people who are trying to get out, and they will either die or have injuries. And you will have people who are stuck in rooms. And so if you are able to find an open window, they have to make a decision if they're going to jump or if they're going to be consumed by fire. And so you make your decision. And remember, I told you it was the 8th to 10th floor. And so you will have some people that will decide to jump out windows. And they're jumping out windows onto a sidewalk, okay? You will have people then that will, like bystanders, right, citizens, will try and catch people and break their fall with their coats. And so you actually have some people that will jump. You will actually, surprisingly enough, you will actually have some people who jumped out of windows and actually lived. And a lot of times that's because citizens were trying to break their fall. But you will actually have people that will jump out of window and will die. And so this Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was horrible. You have 123 women die and 23 men die in this fire. And a lot of the problems were due to poor working conditions and doors locked or only one door for a room, windows locked. And so all the problems with this, and you got to know it's in every single newspaper across the country. There's pictures. And actually what comes out of this, okay, is actually there are going to be changes to factories because there's going to be a huge public outcry, and you will get New York City Council people that will go through factories and they're shocked at the conditions in the factories. So this is the beginning of, okay, you know when like doors have to be open, doors have to remain open during business hours. If you've ever gone to a public place like a store, there's always this little sticker above the door that says these doors will remain during working hours. That's where it comes from. Another thing is that you have to have, if you have X amount of people in a room, you have to have X amount of ways to exit the room. So when you go into like a classroom, this is kind of odd for me because I'm usually in a classroom when I'm lecturing on this. If you're in a classroom and you know how they'll say that, you can only have like 49 students or there's only 49 available positions or seats in a classroom, that is because it's a fire code. And they basically look at the classrooms and they say there's X amount of people that can actually get out comfortably and quickly from a room. And so that is part of it. When you're in a lecture hall and you have 100+ students, there are actually many doors. There's usually doors basically in the back. They usually have side doors because you have more people so they can exit in a hurry. Another thing, if you've ever noticed or thought about, when you're in a classroom, doors always open outward, okay? It makes it easier to get out in an emergency. Some of this begins with this fire. They have a long way to go. They don't set everything in place, but it's kind of like the beginning of that. And so when you talk about changes within the factory, they're going to start to change after 1911. Not the long working hours, not the poor pay, okay, or child labor, but basically the conditions within the factories are going to start to get cleaned up a little bit. Okay, now another thing, still talking about labor, is they're going to push for protective labor laws. 1908, you're going to have a case, and this is a slide on your PowerPoint. It's called Mueller versus Oregon. Mueller versus Oregon is going to be a Supreme Court case that is going to basically deal with the hours that women can work. So it basically said women of childbearing years, or what they refer to as women of childbearing abilities, basically deserve protective labor laws. And basically what it's going to do is going to decrease the amount of hours that women can work, basically so they don't have to be in the factory as long, and the idea is that they can actually get more rest. Now, having said that, okay, there's definitely loopholes in it by the way it's written. It's going to exclude women of color, and this will also exclude agricultural workers and also white-collared women. So if you're talking about like professionals, teachers, nurses, that is not going to appear to them. And I also believe it doesn't affect women who are like working in an office. So it's basically kind of aimed at women like working in factories, okay? But there's loopholes to it, so it doesn't apply to everyone across the board. Okay, now, having said all that, okay, you can look at Mueller versus Oregon however you want to. Some people are happy about it, and some people are not happy about it. Some women are like, hey, if it gets me less hours and I can be home with my kids and do a little bit more at home, I'm all there. But then some people will say, some women will say, I need the money. I actually need to work the extra 2-3 hours because I need the money. But now they can't. So it kind of depends on how you see it, okay? And then also, not by 1912, you're going to have some women that will say that they definitely want to push for protective laws for women, but they will say that they knew what was best for women and they wanted to create the protective laws. They didn't want the Supreme Court to say this is the way you're going to do it. They will say that they know what's best for their workers, so they're the ones that basically want to propose how to do it. Then there's also another group basically saying that by saying this, by what Mueller is saying, is that it created women as a distinct group and it focused on weakness. And that's not right. And they were saying that women should fight on equal grounds as male workers and just get less hours just overall in general. And they're basically trying to portray women as weak, delicate things. And that's not true. If you want to decrease hours, why don't you just decrease it across the board? So you would think that this whole Mueller versus Oregon would be kind of a little bit of a slam dunk, right? If you were like working in factories and you're like, hey, this is going to help me. But that wasn't always how it was perceived. There were definitely arguments to it. Okay, moving on to professional women. Professional women, many women, or I should say relatively a good amount of women, are going to enter into the professional fields. And we're talking doctors, lawyers, okay? But you're also talking midwives, nursing, teaching, social work is now basically a woman's profession. Librarians now is a female profession. So you definitely see women going into those professions. Now remember that all those positions, they're not going to make a whole lot of money. Okay, a good example is when you talk about teachers. 1900, male teachers were making $34 a week and women were making $14 a week. So the work is definitely not going to be high-paying work, but it is going to put you into middle class. If you're a teacher or if you're a nurse, if you're a social worker, librarian, anything like that, even midwife, you're not going to be living in poverty. Okay, but you're also not gonna get what a man would get for the same job. Okay, I had mentioned it before. More women are going into law of medicine. 1900, 9,000 women had medical licenses. Women definitely would go into law, but once again, they weren't necessarily allowed into courtrooms. 1910, you have 1,500 women basically acting as lawyers at that point in time. African American women, they will also go into the jobs that I had mentioned before, as in midwifery, nursing, teaching, librarian, social work. Librarians probably not as much, but I would say more midwifery, nursing, teaching, social work. And they're always working within the African American community. Okay, 1900, you have 160 African American female doctors, but once again, finding work is a little bit hit and miss because it's only their African American community. They can find work within the African American community, but definitely not beyond that. Okay, women in the arts. By 1910, 45% of the artists or art teachers were women. And this is kind of important, especially art teachers. Before, women wouldn't be able to like take classes on art. They just had to do it themselves. So now you have a shift where women are actually being able to take art classes, and 45% of art teachers were women. So that's a very good thing, and that's basically a huge gain for women. You have a woman by the name of Mary Cassatt, C-A-S-S-A-T-T, known for her impressionist paintings and printmaking. That's Mary Cassatt, C-A-S-S-A-T-T, known for her impressionist paintings and printmaking. Women, as I had talked about before, will become journalists. We definitely see more women going into journalism. All the things that I have talked about, all the women that we have talked about in the progressive movement, but you also have women who, one other journalist I want to talk about real quick, Elizabeth Seaman, S-E-A-M-E-N, Elizabeth Seaman. She actually wrote under the name of Nellie Bly, B-L-Y. She became a journalist, and she was definitely a muckraker journalist. She would kind of like go undercover, and she would write about problems in society, and she always wrote under the name Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly, as a writer, actually was very, very popular in that point in time. She was a very popular writer, popular journalist. Okay, other women, and the reason why I'm saying this is they're also writing novels. You have a woman by the name of Frances Watkins Harper. Frances Watkins Harper, 1892. She will write Iola Leroy and also Shadows Uplifted. And this is the first novel written by an African-American woman. Okay, now moving on. I'm still talking about progressivism, but I want to talk about the South and progressivism. Once again, 1890, 1914-ish. You definitely see the South become more industrialized after the Civil War. They built more factories in the South. And the thing is with that, women are going to go work in the factories, even in the South. You will also see a lot of women's clubs develop in the South. Daughters of the American Revolution, Colonial Dames with a D-D-A-M-E-S. You also have temperance unions chapters that will be in the South. So you see a lot of women being a part of organizations in the South. African Americans, after Reconstruction, there's going to be a huge amount of racial prejudice in the South. You'll see Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are basically going to tell African Americans the things that they can't do to keep them in an inferior position, but it's also going to create segregation laws. This is where you see the beginning of segregation in the United States. Now, having said that, you're going to have a landmark case. This is in 1896. You're going to have what's known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is a United States Supreme Court case, and it stated that public facilities could be separate but equal, and it's going to legalize segregation in the United States until 1954, and it's going to be reversed in 1954. So Plessy versus Ferguson is what creates segregation. It creates something for whites, it creates something for blacks in the public accommodations. Yes, it's going to be highly in the South, but because Plessy versus Ferguson is a federal Supreme Court, that means that segregation is going to be segregation at a federal level, meaning across the country. And you'll see segregation come throughout the entire country. You'll see it in the North, you'll see it in the West. And it's definitely there. It might not be quite as much as in the South, but you'll definitely see it, and you'll definitely see it, unfortunately, very strong in the North in certain places. Okay, when you talk about African Americans, middle class and upper class African Americans, and yes, they are definitely there in small numbers, in small percentages, but if you're definitely middle class and upper class, you definitely want to make sure that your daughter, your kids receive education, but they really want to make sure that their daughters are educated and that they'll be able to take care of themselves and basically have a job and take care of themselves. As I mentioned before, settlement houses, you have African American settlement houses, and they are there to basically help African Americans that need the assistance. And they provided education, they provided cooking classes, sewing classes. Depending on the settlement house, they might even teach or have some teacher training programs. But they usually were a good spot for education, whether it's literacy or getting them education so they could go on and basically get like a high school education. Within this community, huge amount of clubs and organizations for the women. Many churches, most African Americans are very religious, so you definitely see the churches being a source of religion, but it's also social. You see a lot of social clubs come from the churches. Clubs can do everything. It can be social, but a lot of times it's basically helping the community. It might be providing education for kids, like kind of like preschool, kindergarten, might have daycare centers, run orphanages, create orphanages, raise money for orphanages, or also providing like basic health care or a basic like kind of like first aid that you can go there if you need like some type of health care. Definitely a huge amount of clubs, and there are clubs all over the South. Okay, now progressivism in the West, same time period, 1890 to 1914. There is a continual movement of people moving out west, so people are moving out west. You definitely have a lot of reform. Temperance movement was huge in the West. You also have the farmers' alliances, and women are definitely going to be a part of the farmers' alliances, the Popularist Party, that is the political party. Mary Lease, L-E-A-S-E, she gave speeches for the Farmers Alliance. She actually was paid, and she actually kind of went around the West and gave speeches for the Farmers Alliance. We already know that in this time period, women are going to get the right to vote, 1896. So there's definitely going to be a huge suffrage movement in the West. And that's going to be very successful. Okay, employed women. It is estimated that 13% of Western women worked outside the house. Where did they work? They worked as domestic servants, as cooks, and a lot of times like clerks in stores and offices, like a general store, or there'll be like a clerk working in like a railroad station, that type of thing. Some hired out as laborers on farms. I wouldn't say that it was as much, but it wasn't that uncommon to see. Other women could go into professions, meaning like nursing, teaching, midwifery, that type of thing. Or professional, meaning doctors and lawyers. I would say you wouldn't see as many female doctors or lawyers in the West, but they're definitely there. One example would be Ella Knowles was an attorney for the Popularist Party. Ella Knowles will be an attorney for the Popularist Party. Okay, Native Americans. Native Americans Overall, in this time period, starting 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, there was this overall movement to help Native Americans. And it kind of depended just kind of on the people and the organizations. You'll have some organizations trying to donate food and medicine. And then there's also this movement, and this is more of a national level coming from the government, a push to assimilate Native Americans. This is where they're going to create boarding schools, and I believe I mentioned the boarding schools in the past lecture. The first boarding school will be Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and then they're going to be all over the country. One of the later ones will be 1900, and that will be Sherman Indian School in Riverside. As I mentioned, I'm just going to mention it briefly because I already talked about it. Children were dressed like Americans, taught English, forbidden to speak their language. They were basically taught to be American. And there was definitely, there's some people that who basically just kind of followed it, and then there's some that there was definitely resistance. Okay, another way to assimilate Native Americans, as I mentioned before, was the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act, this is 1887, broke up tribal land. Each male member was able to receive their own land, 160 acres per family or 80 acres as an individual. They had to live on that land for 25 years before they got the deed to that land. Now, having said that, you'll have tribes that will resist it. The Sioux out in the plains area was very resistant to any of that. They definitely wanted their lifestyle and to keep their lifestyle. But you will also see when you talk about women, Sioux women, they produced textiles, they did some quilting, they did knitting, they did beadwork, and they would definitely sell and they could be selling those off reservation land as a way to get money. Some Native American women adopted American ways. It's just kind of one of those personal decisions. You have 5 sisters of an Omaha tribe that became educated. 4 of them will become doctors, medical doctors, and then one of them will basically be a lecturer on Indian rights. And those that became doctors will then basically provide medical care for their tribe. Okay, just a couple of other groups in the West, Hispanic women. Once again, as I mentioned before, they're now starting to live in more segregated areas, which are known as kind of barrios, except for those who have large ranches or large farms. In a sense, they have more money. Okay, but another thing, because more Americans, basically white Americans, are moving out southwest, and there had been adoption of Hispanic ways, Mexican ways, Spanish ways, if you will, however you want to say that. And there was a blending of their cultures, but there was definitely still a promotion of a lot of various things within the Hispanic culture. But now you're starting to see those things diminish because more white people are coming. And a good example is like Cinco de Mayo celebrations. It's still there, but definitely not as much, and it's not as prominent as it once was. Spanish is being replaced in schools now. Basically, English is taught. And once again, it's not that people aren't speaking Spanish, because they are, but when you talk about mainstream, it's starting to move away from that. When you talk about organizations, you still have a lot of organizations. You have like women's charity associations. A lot of the associations would be associated with the Catholic Church. Women, for the most part, had strong groups. They kind of had strong kinship groups, definitely family groups, but then also through organizations, through the church, friends, that type of thing. So usually they actually did have a large support system. African American women. African American women, you're definitely going to see organized clubs out in the West. A lot of them, once again, associated with churches. You have women become teachers and nurses, once again, for within their own community. But you also see them working a lot as like domestic servants and cooks, basically laborers. And once again, obviously, a huge amount of discrimination. One woman definitely pushing the boundaries, a deviant woman, Mary Fields of Montana, African-American woman, Mary Fields of Montana. She was a stagecoach driver, and that is definitely not a normal job for a woman. She smoked cigars and always had a 380 Smith & Wesson with her. I don't know if she ever used it, but it was said that she knew how to use it. So once again, a woman definitely kind of pushing the boundaries of society, and obviously doing well because we hear about her, a good century later. Okay, Asian women, you have more of them coming over, and there's a huge amount of discrimination. Definitely by this time period, when you're talking 1800s or 1880s, there's going to be a large anti-immigrant feeling in the United States, and there's going to be a lot of discrimination towards the Chinese. Once again, as I mentioned, they definitely live in Chinese communities, whether it's large communities, like in San Francisco, you have Chinatown. I'm from Redlands, and I know back then, 1870s, 1880s, we actually had a small community, kind of a Chinatown, if you will, and they basically lived very inclusively in those communities. By 1882, you're going to have what's known as a Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's basically barring immigration of Chinese, and also the Chinese living in the country could not become citizens. It is created in 1882, will be extended in 1892, and it'll be extended into 1902. By 1910, you'll start to see Chinese immigrating once again to the United States. As I said, many of them will basically live in like the San Francisco, Los Angeles area. A lot of them are basically working labor jobs. But once again, there's always a few that basically push the boundaries. And you have a woman now, she's Chinese, but she comes through Hawaii. It's basically China, Hawaii, and then into California. Her name is Dr. Kong Tai Hong, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So Dr. Kong, Kongtaiheong. Okay, and she actually was a doctor in Hawaii, and then when she comes over into California, she will also be a doctor, and obviously a doctor within her community. You also have another woman, her name was Edith Maud Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, Edith Maud Eaton. She's Chinese, okay, but she wrote under the name of Susan Fat, S-U-I-S-I-N-F-A-T. She was a daughter of a Chinese doctor, but she comes over to the United States and will become a well-known writer at this point in time. Now, depending, and this is kind of a hit and miss, every once in a while you'll see some Protestant churches reaching out to the Chinese population, offering them assistance, providing like English classes, basic skill classes, kind of ways to kind of assimilate into the United States, but very hit and miss, okay? Not every Protestant church or community is doing it. Very, very hit and miss. The Japanese, I just want to mention briefly, starting to come in the 1800s, and they're definitely starting to come over in larger numbers when you're talking 1870s, 1880s. A little bit more are coming. Once again, they come over, a lot of times they come over as a family, as married. Every once in a while you'll get some like kind of picture brides that will come over, but a lot of them are coming over as married. And they're definitely working at this point in time. They usually do labor work until the family can raise money. And then, as I mentioned before, they'll buy a small farm, buy a small business, and that's basically the ultimate goal for them. And then one last thing, I usually try not to end a lecture kind of on a negative note, but at this point in time, there are laws for interracial marriages, definitely within for the, and it's very selective. It's either African American or Chinese, Japanese. There's definitely laws against interracial marriages, not necessarily against the Spanish. You definitely don't see that. All right, and this is basically the end of the progressive lecture.